A week later, Beaumont decided it was time for something more. We met in the same run-down building, the stale smell of mildew clinging to the air. The flickering light overhead cast erratic shadows on the walls, and I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was ours, a sanctuary of sorts. Beaumont stood in the center of the room, his arms crossed, watching me as I entered. "We've covered the basics," he said, his voice steady. "But theory only gets you so far. You need to face something real." A chill ran through me at his words. I knew what he meant, but I wasn't ready. How could I be? I'd barely survived my first encounter with the hunger, and now he was talking about putting me up against something else? Something real? I hesitated, my voice catching in my throat. "Real?" Beaumont nodded. "There's something out in the woods. Small, but dangerous enough to be a threat. It's been feeding on wildlife, animals mostly, but that won't last. Eventually, it'll start looking for something bigger. People, maybe." I felt my chest tighten. "What is it?" "A wraith," he said simply. "Not as old or as powerful as the hunger, but it's still a killer. If you don't stop it, it'll only get worse." A wraith. The word sent a shiver down my spine. I'd read about them in the journal Beaumont had given me. A creature born from death and darkness, feeding on fear and life force. They weren't solid, not in the way most monsters were. They were shadows, specters that moved through the night, barely more than whispers of the dead. "How do you fight something you can't even touch?" I asked, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. Beaumont smiled grimly. "That's where the salt comes in. Salt's pure. It burns things like wraiths, things that don't belong in this world. And silver works on them too, if you can get close enough." The idea of going out there, into the woods, to face something like that, it terrified me. But the thought of doing nothing was worse. If I didn't act, if I didn't learn how to fight back, these things would keep coming. They wouldn't stop. And I wasn't sure I could live with that kind of fear hanging over me for the rest of my life. The night was darker than usual when we set out, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. Beaumont led the way, his movements silent and purposeful, the faint glow of a lantern casting long, twisting shadows across the ground. I followed close behind, gripping the silver knife tightly in one hand, a small pouch of salt in the other. The woods felt different tonight. Every branch creaked, every leaf rustled, but underneath it all was that same suffocating silence, like the world was waiting for something to happen. We walked in silence for what felt like hours, the trees pressing in around us, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. I could feel the tension building, the weight of the hunt settling over us like a dark cloud. Beaumont had warned me that wraiths were tricky, hard to spot, harder to fight, but I hadn't expected the eerie stillness that accompanied them. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, Beaumont stopped. His head tilted slightly, listening to something I couldn't hear. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, every muscle tensed. The air around us felt colder now, like the temperature. I saw it, a shadow, barely more than a wisp of darkness, but it moved with purpose. The wraith. It slithered through the trees like smoke, its form shifting and undulating as it approached. My breath caught in my throat. How could I fight something that wasn't even solid? Beaumont raised his lantern, the light cutting through the fog just enough to reveal the wraith's face. Or what passed for a face. It was hollow, empty, like the remnants of something long dead. Its eyes were pits of darkness, its mouth a gaping void. It let out a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo through the trees, and the air grew colder still. "Now," Beaumont whispered, his voice low and tense. "Throw the salt." My hands were shaking, but I did as he said, reaching into the pouch and flinging a handful of salt toward the wraith. The moment the salt hit it, the wraith let out a screech, its form recoiling violently, twisting and writhing as the salt burned it like acid. For a moment, it seemed to lose shape, the fog around it dissipating slightly. "Go for the heart," Beaumont shouted, his voice urgent. "The knife!" I didn't hesitate. With the Wraith still writhing in pain, I lunged forward, driving the silver blade toward the center of its chest. The moment the knife made contact, the Wraith let out an ear-splitting scream, its body convulsing as the silver tore through it. The fog thickened around me, blinding me, and for a terrifying second, I thought I had lost it. But then the Wraith collapsed, its form dissolving into the mist, leaving nothing behind but a cold, empty silence. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the knife still clenched in my hand. Beaumont stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area carefully before nodding once. "Well done," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of pride. "You survived." Back at the building, I sat down on the old, splintered chair, my body still trembling from the adrenaline that hadn't yet drained. My hands, once tight around the silver knife, shook uncontrollably, and the cold sweat that clung to my skin felt more like a second layer of flesh. I'd just fought something that should not have existed, something that felt like it was made of nightmares and smoke. Mr. Beaumont, ever composed, poured me a glass of water from a tin pitcher on a nearby table, the clink of the glass breaking the heavy silence that had followed our return. He placed the water in front of me, and I reached for it, my hand still unsteady. I gulped it down, desperate for something to anchor me back to reality, but nothing could erase the memory of that thing's hollow, dark eyes, or the sound of its wail as the salt burned through its form. "You did well," Beaumont said, leaning against the edge of the table. His voice was calm, but I could sense the gravity beneath his words. "Better than most do their first time." "Most?" I rasped, my voice raw from the exhaustion. "How many don't make it?" His expression darkened for a brief moment before he regained his composure. "More than you'd want to know." I leaned back in the chair, my legs weak and my head swimming with the weight of what had just happened. I could still feel the cold of the Wraith clinging to my bones, the sense that it had tried to pull something out of me, something deeper than just my life. I looked down at my hands, stained with salt and blood from where the knife had cut into my palm during the struggle. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice softer. "I fought it, killed it, but is it over?" Beaumont's gaze settled on me, his eyes filled with a kind of understanding I wasn't sure I wanted. "You've stepped into a world that doesn't stop. The creatures you're dealing with, they won't give up just because you've learned a few tricks. Each time you fight, it gets harder, and each time, they know you a little better." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't just survived tonight. I'd become something more, something marked. I knew deep down that the Wraith wasn't the last creature I'd face. It was only the beginning. "What about the hunger?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is it still out there?" Beaumont's eyes narrowed. "It is. The hunger doesn't forget its prey. But tonight, you've learned what it takes to fight back. And next time it comes for you, you'll be ready." The weight of those words sank deep into my chest, heavy and cold. I wasn't ready. Not really. But what choice did I have? The things that lived in the shadows had seen me now, and I couldn't hide from them forever. The next few weeks passed in a haze of training, nightmares, and constant vigilance. Beaumont drilled me relentlessly, pushing me to the edge of exhaustion, and then further. Every day, it felt like I was walking through quicksand, my mind still reeling from the fight with the Wraith, and the knowledge that the hunger was still out there, waiting for me. We went over the basics of protection, sigils, runes, and wards that could be used to keep lesser creatures at bay. I learned how to carve symbols into wood and stone, how to etch them into metal, and how to draw them in the dirt when time was short. But Beaumont made one thing clear: wards were only temporary. "These creatures, especially the old ones, aren't just mindless predators," he explained one afternoon, his hand steady as he drew a complex sigil on the ground. "They learn, they adapt. Wards can buy you time, but they won't save you in the long run. The only way to end it is to take the fight to them." I watched as he traced the lines in the dirt, the shape of the sigil slowly taking form. It was intricate, more than just a simple protection symbol. It was a barrier, a shield meant to keep something out. but I couldn't shake the feeling that no amount of symbols or salt could truly protect me from what was coming. 41. Where do these things even come from? I asked, my voice tinged with frustration. I mean, wraiths. The hunger. Why are they here? Why are they after me? Beaumont paused, his hand hovering over the sigil for a moment before he looked up at me. Some of them have been here longer than we have. They're older than the forests, older than the earth itself. They're drawn to fear, to life, and sometimes to people who can see them. He straightened, wiping the dirt from his hands. You stepped into their world the moment you crossed those tracks, and now they won't let you go.